In the quiet town of Larkspur Vale, where the wind carried dust like forgotten whispers and the sun seemed to watch from a distance without warmth or judgment, there lived a woman whose name people spoke only when they believed no one else was listening, a woman called Alara Quinn. And when she returned after many years away, stepping off the rusted bus with a single suitcase and a posture too straight for a place that had taught its residents to bend, the town itself seemed to inhale and hold its breath because Alara had not left as a woman but as a girl wrapped in rumor and fear, and she had returned not seeking forgiveness or understanding but carrying something far heavier than luggage, something stitched invisibly into her memory, something shaped by silence, by exile, by nights spent replaying moments that no one else remembered correctly. And as she walked down the cracked road toward the house at the edge of town, the house everyone pretended was empty, though they all knew it wasn't, her footsteps echoed, like a voiceover narration spoken directly into the soul of the land. Calm yet deliberate, steady yet charged with unspoken tension. And the house itself seemed to recognize her, its warped wooden boards groaning softly as if greeting an old companion, while Alara paused at the door, breathing in the scent of dust, oil, and time, knowing that this place, this return, marked the beginning of a reckoning neither she nor the town could avoid. For years ago, Larkspur Vale had decided who she was without asking her, had decided what she had done without proof, and had decided she did not belong. And so they sent her away with lowered eyes and righteous certainty. And Alara, then just a child with shaking hands and a heart too full of questions, had learned in that moment how easily truth could be reshaped by fear and how cruelty could hide behind community. And now, as an adult, she had come back not to confront them with anger, but with something far more unsettling: transformation. Because in the years she had spent away, Alara had learned a craft, a quiet art that required patience and precision, an art that turned raw material into meaning, broken things into beauty, and pain into purpose. And though no one in Larkspur Vale yet knew it, that craft would soon weave itself into their lives, altering the way they saw themselves and one another, thread by thread, seam by seam, as Alara unlocked the door and stepped inside, letting the shadows wrap around her like an old coat, setting her suitcase down beside a table scarred by time, and unpacking not clothes but tools, needles gleaming like promises, fabric folded with care, patterns sketched in notebooks filled with notes and margins crowded by thoughts she had never spoken aloud. And as she worked late into the night, a single lamp illuminating her hands as they moved with confidence born of repetition and resolve, the town slept unaware that change had already begun, because stories, like garments, are made piece by piece, and Alara intended to tell hers not with words but with creation, with evidence of who she had become. And the first to notice were the women of Larkspur Vale, drawn to her doorstep by curiosity disguised as necessity, by the need for repairs, adjustments, something new for an old event. And though they arrived cautious and reserved, they left unsettled, because Alara did not simply fix hems or replace buttons. She listened. And in listening, she reflected back to them truths they had buried beneath routine and resignation. And as days passed, her reputation grew, not as the girl who left, but as the woman who transformed cloth into confidence, who could take measurements, not just of bodies but of longing. And soon dresses appeared at gatherings that had once been dull and predictable. Dresses that moved with intention, that caught the light differently, that made people stand a little taller, speak a little softer, question themselves a little more deeply. And with each creation, Alara stitched her presence deeper into the fabric of the town, forcing it to acknowledge her not as a memory but as a force. And still there were those who resisted, who watched from windows and muttered about the past, who believed time did not change truth, only hid it. And among them was the man who had once pointed his finger when everyone else followed, the man whose certainty had been loudest and whose guilt now weighed heaviest, though he would never admit it. And as Alara passed him one afternoon in the street, their eyes met briefly. And in that moment, the years collapsed into a single breath, a single shared understanding that whatever had been buried was not gone, merely waiting. And Alara did not flinch, did not slow her pace, because her return was not about confrontation, but completion, about reclaiming the narrative that had been stolen from her and reshaping it into something undeniable, something visible, something that could not be dismissed as rumor. And as the town prepared for its annual gathering, Celebration of tradition and sameness. Alara worked in silence on a piece unlike any other. A garment that carried within it every mile she had traveled, every night she had doubted herself, every lesson learned through solitude and survival. And though no one knew it yet, that moment when she would finally unveil her work would force Larkspur Vale to look at itself without the comfort of denial, to hear the story it had silenced. Played back not in accusation but in truth, and as Alara tied off the final thread just before dawn, her hands steady and her expression calm, she knew that this was only the beginning, that stories, once set in motion, cannot be undone, and that by returning, by creating, by refusing to disappear, she had already changed everything. As the town moved closer to the day of its annual gathering, the air in Larkspur Vale grew thick with anticipation and unease, though few could have named the feeling without discomfort. Because change has a way of announcing itself long before it arrives, and Alara Quinn, whether she intended to or not, had become its quiet messenger, her presence altering the rhythm of daily life as people found excuses to pass her house, to glance at her windows, to speculate in half-formed sentences that trailed off when she appeared. And inside that house at the edge of town, Alara continued her work with deliberate calm, rising before dawn and working until her hands ached. Not from desperation, but from purpose. Each stitch a meditation, each cut of fabric a reminder that control, once reclaimed, can never truly be taken again. And as she worked, memories surfaced uninvited. Not as sharp pain, but as distant echoes, the laughter that had once turned cruel. The adults who had chosen certainty over compassion. The moment she had realized that silence was not neutrality but complicity. And these memories no longer weakened her. Instead, they guided her, shaping the garment she was creating into something that carried weight beyond its beauty, something that would speak even if she remained silent. And outside her door, the women of Larkspur Vale began to change in subtle ways, their conversations shifting from complaints to possibilities, their reflections in mirrors holding unfamiliar expressions of curiosity and self-recognition. Because Alara's creations did not disguise them, they revealed them. And in doing so, they stirred something dangerous in the town's carefully maintained order, something that unsettled those who benefited from things remaining exactly as they were, and among them was Councilman Hargreave, a man who had built his authority on tradition and memory, who had been present all those years ago when Alara was sent away, and who had said nothing then, convincing himself that restraint was wisdom. And now, watching the town drift toward an event he could not control, he felt the slow tightening of fear, the kind that does not shout but erodes, and he called meetings that accomplished nothing, issued warnings no one obeyed. Because authority loses its edge when it no longer understands the story it claims to protect. And meanwhile, Alara's mother's absence lingered like an unfinished sentence. Her name never spoken aloud, her fate discussed only in fragments, and Alara carried that absence with her as she moved through each day, wondering how different things might have been if one voice had spoken up. If one hand had reached for hers instead of turning away. And yet she did not allow that wondering to become bitterness. Because bitterness consumes from the inside, and Alara had learned to be economical with her energy, spending it only on what could grow. And so when the first invitation arrived, request for a custom piece to be worn at the gathering, she accepted without comment, measuring carefully, listening intently, noticing how the woman's hands trembled as she spoke about wanting to feel seen. And Alara nodded, understanding without judgment, because being unseen had once nearly erased her, and as more requests followed, Alara realized that the gathering would not be a single moment but a convergence, a chorus of stories stitched into fabric, walking side by side under the same sky. And this realization strengthened her resolve, because she understood then that the truth does not always arrive as an accusation. Sometimes it arrives as contrast, as comparison, as undeniable evidence of what could have been. And the closer the day came, the more restless the town became. Gossip intensifying, alliances forming and dissolving, as if everyone sensed that something was approaching and each was scrambling to decide where to stand when it did. And in the evenings when the work was done and the light faded, Alara would step outside and look toward the hills beyond Larkspur Vale, remembering the long road that had taken her away and the even longer one that had brought her back, and she would breathe deeply, grounding herself in the present, reminding herself that she had survived worse than whispers, worse than stares, worse than resistance, because she had survived being erased. And nothing frightened her more than returning to that state, and so she refused to shrink, refused to soften her presence to make others comfortable, and when the night before the gathering finally arrived, Larkspur Vale lay awake beneath a restless sky. The streets unusually quiet, the air charged with unsaid things, while inside her house, Alara completed the final adjustments to her own garment. The one she would wear not as a declaration, but as a culmination, its lines simple yet deliberate, its structure strong yet fluid, reflecting the woman she had become rather than the girl they remembered. And as she dressed herself in the early hours of morning, fastening each piece with steady hands, she caught her reflection and held it, not with pride or defiance, but with recognition. Because this was not about proving anything, it was about reclaiming authorship, about stepping into a space she had been denied and occupying it fully. And when she stepped outside, just as the sun began to rise, the town seemed momentarily suspended, as if even the buildings were waiting, and people gathered in the square later that day under banners that celebrated continuity and tradition, unaware that the most significant tradition of all, the tradition of silence, was about to be challenged, not by confrontation but by visibility. As the women arrived one by one wearing Alara's creations, each different, each unmistakably intentional, drawing attention not through extravagance but through presence, and murmurs rippled through the crowd as people noticed the shift. The way confidence altered posture, the way authenticity commanded space. And when Alara herself finally entered the square, conversations faltered, eyes turned, and for a moment time seemed to slow. Because the town was being forced to reconcile the memory it had preserved with the reality standing before it, and in that moment, without a single word spoken, Larkspur Vale began to understand that stories do not remain buried simply because we refuse to tell them. They wait, patient and persistent, for the moment when they can no longer be ignored. And as the music began and the gathering officially commenced, Alara stood at the edge of the crowd, calm and composed, knowing that the most difficult part was yet to come, because the unveiling of truth is rarely dramatic at first. It is subtle, unsettling, and irreversible, and once begun, it reshapes everything it touches. As the gathering unfolded beneath the open sky, the initial novelty of Alara Quinn's return began to give way to something far more uncomfortable for the people of Larkspur Vale, because it was no longer possible to dismiss her as a passing curiosity or a talented outsider. She was present in every conversation, every glance, every pause that lingered a second too long. And as the music drifted through the square and laughter attempted to reclaim its familiar shape, an undercurrent of reckoning pulsed beneath the surface, carried in the way people watched one another, searching for cues on how to respond. And Alara observed it all with quiet attentiveness, not standing apart out of fear but out of choice, understanding that distance can be a form of clarity. And she saw how some faces softened with something like regret while others hardened in defense, because reflection is not a neutral act, it demands something in return. And as the afternoon wore on, stories began to circulate again. Not the crude rumors of the past, but fragmented recollections, hesitant admissions of uncertainty. Moments when people realized that what they had accepted as truth had never been examined closely. And this shift unsettled those who had relied on collective certainty to absolve themselves. And among them was Councilman Hargreave, who moved through the crowd with practiced ease yet felt increasingly out of place. His words landing with less authority than before, his gestures echoing hollowly. Because power falters when it is no longer mirrored by belief, and Alara sensed this change without seeking it, recognizing that influence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of resistance. And then came the moment no one had planned for, when a woman named Maribel, one of the oldest residents of the town and someone who had been present during the events that drove Alara away, stepped forward unexpectedly and spoke Alara's name. Aloud in front of everyone, her voice trembling not with fear, but with effort. And in that single utterance the crowd fell silent, because names carry weight, they summon memory. And Maribel's gaze met Alara's not in accusation or pity, but in something like apology. And she spoke then of uncertainty, of how quickly the town had decided, of how easy it had been to let the loudest voices shape the story. And though her words were not a confession in the formal sense, they cracked open the narrative just enough for doubt to rush in. And Alara listened without interruption, her expression composed. because she had not returned seeking vindication from one voice or one moment. She had returned to restore complexity to a story that had been flattened by fear, and as Maribel stepped back, others shifted uneasily, some nodding, some turning away, but none able to pretend they had not heard. And the gathering resumed in fragments, the music starting again, conversations attempting to regain their rhythm. But something had shifted irreversibly, and Ilara felt it as clearly as a change in weather, the moment when pressure gives way. And the air moves freely again, and later, as dusk approached and lanterns were lit, Ilara found herself approached by people who had once avoided her. Their words cautious yet sincere, offering not excuses but questions, and she answered them with honesty measured by restraint, because she understood that the truth does not require embellishment to be powerful. And as the night deepened, the town square transformed into a place both familiar and strange, where tradition and transformation coexisted uneasily, and Ilara's presence served as a mirror, reflecting back to Larkspur Vale the cost of its silence, and somewhere between the music and the shadows, Councilman Hargreave made a decision, driven less by courage than by desperation. And he approached Ilara with the intention of reclaiming control, framing the past as a misunderstanding, an unfortunate convergence of events that no one could have predicted. And as he spoke, Ilara recognized the pattern immediately, the language of minimization, the careful avoidance of responsibility, and she listened politely until he finished, and then she responded not with accusation but with clarity, stating simply that misunderstanding implies mutual confusion, and what had happened to her had been neither mutual nor confusing, and her calm dismantled his authority more effectively than anger ever could, because it exposed the fragility of his narrative, and as word of the exchange spread, the town watched as the man who had once spoken with certainty retreated, unsettled and diminished, and in that moment Ilara realized that her return had achieved something she had not consciously sought. It had redistributed attention, shifted the center of gravity away from those who had controlled the story and toward those who had lived within its consequences. And when the gathering finally drew to a close and people began to disperse under the starlit sky, Ilara remained behind, standing in the quiet aftermath, aware that while the event itself was ending, the process it had begun was only just unfolding. Because reckoning is not a single act, but a series of choices, repeated over time. And as she walked home through streets that felt subtly altered, she understood that the town would now have to decide what to do with the truth it could no longer deny. And as she closed her door behind her and leaned against it briefly, allowing herself a moment of stillness, Ilara knew that whatever came next, resistance, acceptance, or something in between, she would face it not as the girl who had been sent away, but as the woman who had returned, whole and unyielding, carrying her story not as a burden but as a foundation. And outside, Larkspur Vale slept uneasily, its dreams disrupted by the realization that silence once broken cannot be restored, and that the future, like a garment freshly cut, now awaited its final form. Asterisk, in the days that followed the gathering, Larkspur Vale entered a strange and unfamiliar quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of routine, but the charged stillness that follows disruption, when people move more slowly, speak more carefully, and listen. Not just to one another but to themselves. And Ilara Quinn felt this shift immediately as she went about her work. The streets no longer filled with sideways glances alone, but with moments of hesitation, of recognition, as if the town itself were relearning how to see, and some doors opened more easily now, while others remained firmly shut. Because reckoning does not arrive evenly, it fractures, revealing fault lines that were always there, and Ilara did not rush this process, understanding that truth, once introduced, must be allowed to settle into its own shape, and so she continued to work, taking commissions selectively, not out of bitterness but discernment, choosing projects that resonated with honesty rather than spectacle. And through these choices, she modeled something the town had rarely practiced: intentionality. And gradually, conversations deepened, moving beyond surface politeness into reflections that had once felt too dangerous to voice, with people acknowledging the cost of conformity, the ease with which they had surrendered judgment to the crowd. And Ilara listened without claiming moral high ground, because she knew that understanding grows best in the absence of humiliation. And yet not everyone welcomed this evolution, and resistance began to organize itself quietly, coalescing around familiar figures who spoke of disruption and instability, who framed Alara's presence as an unsettling influence rather than a catalyst for truth, and Councilman Hargreave, though diminished, still wielded enough influence to rally those who feared change more than injustice. And meetings were held behind closed doors, narratives rehearsed that cast Alara as a divisive figure, someone reopening wounds best left untouched. And Alara sensed this tension not through rumor but through absence, through the sudden withdrawal of certain voices. The way some people avoided her gaze once more, and she accepted this as part of the process. Because transformation rarely proceeds without backlash, and the measure of its necessity is often the intensity of the resistance it provokes. And in the midst of this, a letter arrived from a regional arts council, an invitation to present her work beyond Larkspur Vale, an opportunity that would have once felt like escape but now felt like choice. And Alara held the letter for a long time before opening it, considering what it represented, because leaving again would be easy, but staying carried weight, and she realized then that her return had never been about permanence in the physical sense. It had been about presence, about altering the narrative enough that it could no longer erase her or anyone else. And after careful thought, she accepted the invitation with a condition: that her work remain rooted in the community, that it reflect not just her story, but the collective evolution of a town learning, slowly and imperfectly, to face itself. And this decision further unsettled those who hoped her influence would fade with distance. And as word spread, lines were drawn more clearly, forcing individuals to choose not sides but values. And amid this tension, Alara experienced moments of unexpected connection, including a visit from Maribel, who brought with her an old box containing fragments of the past photographs, notes, items that had belonged to Alara's mother. And as they sat together in the quiet of Alara's house, the weight of history settled between them, not oppressive but solemn. And Maribel spoke then of regret not as an attempt at absolution, but as acknowledgement. And Alara listened, allowing herself to feel both the loss and the relief of having that loss finally recognized. And this moment, though private, marked a turning point because it affirmed what Alara had come to understand, that healing does not erase pain. It contextualizes it, giving it a place within a larger narrative rather than allowing it to define the whole. And as the weeks passed, Larkspur Vale began to change in small but visible ways. Meetings became more inclusive, decisions more deliberate. And while not everyone embraced this shift, the old certainty no longer held. And Alara watched this evolution with measured hope, aware that progress is rarely linear. And when Councilman Hargreave eventually resigned, citing personal reasons, the announcement landed without drama because his authority had already dissolved. And in the space he left behind, new voices emerged, hesitant yet sincere. And through it all, Alara remained grounded in her work, using creation as both anchor and language. And as the season shifted and the air grew cooler, she prepared for the presentation beyond town limits, not as a departure, but as an extension, carrying with her the story of Larkspur Vale not as a cautionary tale, but as a living example of what happens when silence is challenged. And on the night before she left, Alara stood once more outside her house, looking at the road that had once symbolized exile and now represented possibility. And she understood then that home is not a place that grants belonging unconditionally. It is a place that must be negotiated, redefined, and sometimes reclaimed. And as she turned back inside, she did so with the knowledge that whatever awaited her beyond the horizon, the story she had reclaimed would continue to shape not only her future, but the future of the town that had once tried to forget her. Because stories, once rewritten with truth, do not fade. They endure. The morning sun rose over Larkspur Vale with a gentle persistence, casting golden light over rooftops and streets that had witnessed both cruelty and courage. And Alara Quinn stood at the edge of her doorway one last time before leaving, the weight of her suitcase light compared to the heft of what she carried. In memory and intention, because she had learned that return is never simply about arrival. It is about recognition, and every step she had taken in this town had been measured, deliberate, an unfolding of both patience and power. And as she walked down the familiar road toward the bus, she noted the subtle changes around her, the straightened posture of women who once slunk through shadows, the guarded curiosity of men who had once dismissed her, the way the morning breeze seemed to carry whispers of possibility instead of judgment. And each observation reminded her that transformation is cumulative, a series of small alterations that together become undeniable. And though the bus waited at the edge of town, its engine quiet, its seats empty, It felt less like escape and more like continuation, a vessel for the next chapter. And when she stepped aboard, she allowed herself a brief glance back at the place that had once rejected her, that had attempted to define her story for her, and she saw it now with new eyes, not as an enemy, but as a canvas. A space upon which change could take root, grow, and flourish if only nurtured with courage, integrity, and attention. And in that moment, she realized the full measure of her return. She had not come to punish, nor merely to prove. She had come to reestablish equilibrium, to show that agency cannot be stolen, that truth cannot be permanently hidden. Asterisk, and that beauty and consequence can coexist in the same narrative. And as the bus began to move, leaving behind the square, the houses and the hills, Alara thought of the stories she had woven into the town's fabric, each stitch, each garment, each act of quiet observation and deliberate intervention, as a seed, not yet flowering but certain in its potential. And she reflected on Maribel's visit, the photographs, the letters, and the fragments of her mother's life, recognizing that memory is not static, it is a living element, shifting as it is acknowledged. And that even absence carries lessons if attended to with care. And as the wheels turned, she imagined how each resident would navigate the days ahead, some struggling, some embracing, some lingering in the shadows of hesitation. And she accepted all these outcomes with calm because influence, once released, moves according to its own logic, untethered from intent, and the bus carried her steadily forward, down winding roads that shimmered with frost in the early light, through valleys she remembered and forests she had once feared. And as the town receded behind her, Alara felt a profound clarity, a sense of closure not in the dramatic sense but in the quiet, cumulative sense, knowing that she had returned, acted, and exited on her own terms, and the lessons of Larkspur Vale would ripple outward, subtle but indelible, because the stories that had been silenced could never again be fully contained. And as she looked out the window at the changing landscape, clouds shifting above distant mountains, sunlight catching on streams and fields, she felt the full spectrum of her journey, from exile to reclamation, from fear to mastery, from girlhood to womanhood, and understood that the craft she had honed was more than dressmaking. It was the art of presence, of assertion, of embodying one's own narrative so fully that it shapes not only the self but the world it inhabits. And in that realization, she felt an unshakable peace, not the fleeting relief of victory, but the enduring assurance of having lived authentically, fully and deliberately. And as the bus climbed a ridge and the town finally vanished from view, she exhaled, letting go of what had weighed her in youth, and embraced what had carried her forward. Knowledge that stories, like the garments she created, are stitched with care, threaded with intent, and when properly tended, become both armor and invitation, both shield and revelation. And as the horizon opened ahead, Alara Quinn sat with the quiet certainty that she would continue to move through the world with the same deliberate grace, observing, creating, and bearing witness, knowing that her voice, once suppressed, now spoke through every action, every stitch, and every thoughtful decision, and that Larkspur Vale, like all places touched by truth, would never be the same again. And the journey, though outwardly beginning anew, was in truth the continuation of a story already reclaimed, complete in its essence, infinite in its resonance, and fully, irreversibly hers.